Well, thank you very much, Professor Zhang, for your very kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here at my old school, Peking University. I studied here a long time ago, maybe before a few of you were even born. I studied at Peking University in 1989, nearly 24 years ago. And so it's a very special privilege for me to have the opportunity to come back to my alma mater and to have a chance to spend a wonderful, cool, and pleasant fall evening with all of you here. And thank you for your time and for coming. I'm very honored to be here and to be a part of this lecture series, the Peking University Public Policy Forum International. I think the topic at hand in terms of the U.S. presidential campaign 2012 is very important, certainly for the American people, but I think it's also very important for China and for the world. The United States now faces a very clear choice that is just 9 days away. And I think a lot of interesting things are going to be happening over these 9 days. And tonight, I want to talk to you about a few different aspects of the U.S. presidential election. So first of all, what I'd like to do is start by discussing the economic picture in the United States from 2008, the end of 2008, until the present. That kind of paints a backdrop and gives us a foundation on which we can understand, on the basis of which we can understand what's happening in the presidential race today. The second thing I'd like to discuss is basically key concepts and issues in the 2012 campaign. There are some important ideas that I think may be fairly familiar to an American audience, but might be worth mentioning and discussing in the context of a foreign audience trying to make sense of what's happening in the U.S. election. Third, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the role that China has played in the U.S. presidential contest. I think many of you, or perhaps most of you, are very keenly aware that China has been mentioned many times. And yet, China has been mentioned in some ways in ways that are very different from the way that it had been mentioned before. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Finally, I'll just say a few words about these final 9 days of the presidential campaign, where we are, what's going to be happening, and perhaps what we can expect next Tuesday on November 6th. I note that the U.S. presidential election, the general election in the United States, is taking place separated by only 2 days from a very important political transition here in China, the 18th Party Congress. And as a matter of fact, I'll come back to this point later, but I think it's very rare that both the United States and China go through political transitions so closely to each other. In fact, it only happens once every 20 years that the United States and China both have their major transitions in the same year. That's because the United States is on a 4-year cycle and China is on a 5-year cycle. So this is a very rare year, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later. The last thing I'll do then is offer a few concluding thoughts, and then after all of that, I certainly hope to spend perhaps 40 minutes or so, or even longer, if you have time, hearing your questions and your comments and having a good discussion about what the presidential race means for America and means for China. So with that, let me start with the first topic, which is the question of what I would call the state of the union in the United States today, in the year 2012, looking back at where we've come from 2008 to the present. The fact of the matter is, it's been a very challenging time for the United States over the last 4 years. I think all of us know that. We've been really in an economic period of difficulty that is unlike any other in terms of the length and the intensity of the economic pain that the United States has been going through. I think everyone knows that the financial crisis really began in 2008. At the end of 2008, there was kind of a meltdown in our financial system. Everyone is aware of that. And it affected tens of millions of Americans and the American people broadly in very direct ways that I'll talk about. And that impact we're still feeling today, both in terms of the economy, but also in terms of the presidential campaign. The economic difficulties that the United States has been going through also, in many ways, shook the confidence of the American people in a way that has not been the case since the late 1970s. In the late 1970s, when Jimmy Carter was president, we had a scenario where we had rising gas prices and oil prices, where we had difficult economic times, inflation, very high interest rates, and for a little while the American people had a lot of anxiety about what the future would hold. Since that time, I think we had a pretty good run, but now we have this kind of anxiety in the United States today, and that forms a backdrop for the presidential race that has unfolded over the last 2 years. Let me say a few words about the key attributes of the United States economy and the social landscape over the last 4 years. I think first and foremost we start with a very basic point, and that is that the United States economy has grown very slowly over these last 4 years. In fact, for a number of months, from late 2008 into 2009, we actually had a recession, where in some ways the United States economy shrunk rather than grew. Then it stabilized and kind of flatlined for a while, and now it's growing again, but it's not growing at the same pace that it used to grow. We're accustomed to the U.S. economy growing at 2 or 3% or even a little higher a year. And now, in recent years, we've been in negative growth, zero growth, just slightly positive growth. And the bottom line is it's not something that the American people are used to. Very directly related to that is, of course, the issue of employment. I think everyone understands that the U.S. unemployment rate is much higher today than it has historically been in recent years. And in fact, it was very high right after President Obama took office. In early 2009, it actually got up well over 10%. To put it in perspective, in normal economic times, U.S. unemployment might be a little over 5%. So it was double what it normally has been during fairly good times. And during great times, we've seen the unemployment rate go as low as 4.6% in the 1990s. That's what we like to see in the United States. It's been double that in recent years. And so millions of Americans are out of work. And many people have had very difficult times finding jobs over the last several years. A third attribute of the economic landscape, and something that hits very close to home to the American people, is what has happened with housing prices. So across the country, housing prices rose, and American families and middle-class families saw their wealth rise as housing prices rose, because most Americans have most of their wealth in their homes. But in recent years, home prices have dropped, in some cases, dramatically. In the state of Florida, there are quite a few communities in Florida, in the southeast United States, where home prices have dropped by 80%. There are people who bought their homes for $500,000. Today, that home is worth $100,000. And it gets worse. In those cases, those folks owe more money to the bank than their home is worth. They have a loan from the bank for $250,000 or $300,000 or $350,000, but their home is only worth $100,000 if they sold it today. We call that being, quote, underwater. And there are millions of Americans who are underwater on their homes today. That's an extreme case, but in many cases, home prices really have come down fairly dramatically. And that hits Americans very, very hard in an economic sense, but also in a psychological sense. The next 2 points I would make are directly related to each other, again about the economic landscape. And that is that in recent years, U.S. incomes have gone down, not up. They haven't stayed the same. They haven't grown at a slower rate. They've gone down. 4 years ago, the average American family was making $4,000 more than that same family is making today. So, on the one hand, you have incomes that are declining over the last 4 years. That started in 2008 and continues to the present. Middle-class families are hurting. At the same time, the cost of living has gone up a little bit. We haven't had terrible inflation, but we've had some inflation, which is normal. And so incomes are dropping, prices are increasing, and average families across the United States of America are having a difficult time, more than they ever have before, making ends meet. That is a very serious problem that hits people at a very direct and real way in their pocketbooks, and it means people feel less secure about their futures. The last thing that I would like to point out is that as I describe the U.S. economic landscape from 2008 to the present, is that the stock market has not done particularly well during this 4-year period. It actually has done very well this year. But the previous 3 years, it didn't do all that well on the aggregate. And in fact, from about 2000 to the present, basically the stock market has remained fairly flat. Only in the last year have we really seen significant growth relative to 2000. Some people in the United States refer to this as the so-called lost decade. Lost decade, because for 10 years, money that they had invested didn't go anywhere overall after 10 years. It didn't go up, didn't go down, it stayed the same, which means that it was worth less than it was before because of inflation. Why does the stock market matter? It matters because you may not realize, but 50% of Americans own stocks. 50%, half the nation owns stocks either directly or through mutual funds. And specifically, many tens of millions of Americans own mutual funds, that's to say, shares of stocks, through their retirement accounts. We call them oftentimes 401ks. You may have heard that phrase. A 401k is a type of retirement account that Americans use to save money for their future, for their retirement, and it has certain tax benefits. Many people, most, hold 401k accounts in mutual funds, which means because the stock market has not performed well, they've lost money or not seen any gains in their savings for retirement, which means they have less money than they thought they would have to retire on. And again, it generates a sense of insecurity among people who are thinking about reaching retirement age. So all of this started back in late 2008, in September specifically. And at that time, we were just 2 months before the last presidential election, when Barack Obama was running against John McCain. And these negative trends in the economy, in a sense, helped Barack Obama become the President of the United States, because the economic position of the United States was perceived by the American people to have deteriorated drastically under President Bush, who was a Republican. And therefore, many Americans said, let's move away from Republicans, let's vote for the Democrat, let's vote for Barack Obama, because perhaps he can do a better job. So this economic mess helped bring Barack Obama to the White House. 4 years later, however, this economic mess, which has improved a little bit, but not much in relative terms, is now a major challenge for President Barack Obama. and his challenger, Governor Mitt Romney of Massachusetts, is using the economy as the central theme in his campaign. We'll talk more about that later. Now, with that sort of basic backdrop of what's happening in America, I think it's possible to start talking about the campaign and to understand better the dynamics of the presidential campaign. Let me just make a brief point that I could go on at greater length about, but I'll try to keep it short because I want to leave time for your questions and for discussion. But I think there are four key ideas to understand as we talk about any presidential campaign. The first is public policy, the second is politics, the third is campaigns, and the fourth is elections. Let me say one or two sentences about each. Public policy is ultimately the prize of presidential campaigns. People run for president not just to go live in a pretty house. They run for president because they want to win and have a chance to shape public policy in America. That's the prize, influence over public policy. And public policy in America is basically about one thing: giving the American people more choices and better quality choices in all aspects of their lives: education, healthcare, and the list goes on. So that's what public policy is about. Then there's politics. In order to generate public policy, you have to negotiate, debate, disagree, agree, go back and forth with all of the other elected officials. Vice President, the members, 535 members of the United States Congress. The same is true at the state level, the same is true at the local level. So politics is a critical process that leads to the formulation of public policy. And what is politics about? Politics is about finding the equilibrium, and here I'm talking about the federal level, between what the American people expect from their government on the one hand, and what the American people are willing to pay in taxes on the other. You have to have some balance between those two things. That's what politics is about. Because after all, we have scarce resources. We don't have all the money in the world. We have to make choices. We have to prioritize A over B and B over C. If there were limitless resources, there wouldn't be politics. Politics is a fight for resources, and we have to balance that equation. The third thing that I want to mention is campaigns. What are campaigns about? To get to a point where you can engage in politics, you have to be elected. And to be elected, you have to campaign. And campaigns are about exactly one thing, only one thing. Very simply, campaigns are about communication. That is what a campaign, particularly a presidential campaign, is about. Billions and billions of dollars are raised by presidential candidates, and almost every single dollar is spent on communication. 2/3 of all money that presidents and presidential candidates raise goes to television, specifically television, and the rest goes to other forms of communication. So campaigns are about communication. And finally, elections. What are elections about? Elections are not about issues or ideas, as strange as that may sound. Elections are about identity. Identity. Most Americans don't look at the 25-point plan for energy, the 75-point plan for economic recovery, and the list goes on. They make an impressionistic judgment, something in a way similar to what I'm going to say. Which of these candidates has a vision for America that broadly matches my own? Which of these people is sort of more like me and shares the values that I share about this country and its future? And that's the level at which most people vote for president. No one really goes through and looks at every page of the website and every detailed plan, but they come to an impressionistic sense, a sense of shared identity, and the identity of our nation. So what will America look like in 4 years if candidate A is elected? And what will America look like in 4 years if candidate B is elected? And which of those visions do I like? So campaigns are about the communication of identity. if you win the campaign, and you win by better communicating a sense of identity that resonates with 50% plus one of the people, basically. You win by better communicating that vision, you get to enter politics, and then you use politics to generate public policy. And hopefully, you balance the budget while you do it. That doesn't always happen, and we'll talk more about that. But those are the basic ideas. Now with that, let me just say a few things about some key ideas in the U.S. presidential election. I think to understand where we are today, 9 days out from November 6th, the day of the election, you have to know how this campaign began and basically some of the key concepts in the campaign and the key issues that are being debated in the campaign today by the two candidates. Let me start by talking about the rhythm of a presidential campaign. Generally speaking today, presidential campaigns in the United States last about 2 years. Some cases they even start earlier than that because people oftentimes are making preparations to get ready to run over a period of time. But in fact, generally speaking, the formal campaign lasts about 2 years. As you may know, the United States has midterm elections in the even-numbered years other than presidential campaign years. So 2010, 2006, 2002, we have midterm elections. In 2010, after the midterm elections in November, this race for president began. It's been going on 2 years. Now, we have an incumbent president. President Barack Obama is the president. Last time, in 2008, we did not have an incumbent president. Two people were working and campaigning to win the White House because there was no sitting president. Now, President Obama is running as an incumbent. And so he was unchallenged on the Democratic side because nowadays nobody seriously challenges a sitting president from within his own party. But on the Republican side, about 9 people said, I'm running for president. And they competed with each other to get the Republican nomination for the presidency. That was a process that played out from the late part of 2010 and early 2011 all the way through this spring. And ultimately, Governor Mitt Romney, a Republican who was the governor of Massachusetts, won that contest by slowly and methodically defeating all of the other 8 candidates in a series of primary elections that were held all across America, starting in Iowa, going to New Hampshire, and then on to South Carolina, Florida, and a number of other, well, all of the other states ultimately. So that's significant to note because whereas President Obama didn't have any internal competition, because he's the president, no one challenged him from the Democratic side, Governor Mitt Romney rose to the nomination by defeating 8 other people, men and women. So with that, let me say a couple of words about what happens after someone gets the nomination. So Mitt Romney received the nomination effectively this spring. It was formally codified at the Republican National Convention, which I'll come back to. But effectively, he became the nominee around March or April. And from that time on, we started talking about the general election, where you have a one-on-one contest between President Obama and Governor Romney. And this is when campaigns start to think about their general election themes. When you're running in the Republican primary to win the nomination, and your competitors are not President Obama, your competitors are other Republicans, you have to show that you're different from them, and you have to appeal to Republican voters who are generally very conservative, or more conservative than average American voters. And so in the Republican primary campaign, your agenda is a little different than what it ends up being in the general campaign, because once you win the nomination, probably having moved to the right a little bit, to the more conservative positions in order to win the primaries, you then have to move back to the center in order to win the general election, because most American voters are rather moderate. So you have a difference qualitatively between the primaries and the general election. In the summer, this year it was in the late summer and early September, we have our national conventions. In a certain sense, you might think of these like the 18th Party Congress that's about to happen here, but in many ways they're very different. Every 4 years, the Republican and Democratic parties get together and they take care of party business, but they also formally nominate their presidential candidates. Thank you. And what they do is they present, thank you very much, they present those candidates to the American people. The conventions are significant. I want to make 2 points here, because the Republican National Convention or Democratic National Convention is usually the first time that the American people see the candidate. In this case, President Obama is the candidate, so the American people are very familiar with him. But in the case of Governor Romney, the Republican National Convention was the first time that Governor Romney had the opportunity to address the American people as a whole. So this was kind of finally the moment, after many, many months, a year and a half of campaigning every day, finally he spoke to the nation. And that's when the American people got to know him really for the first time. Now, what usually happens after convention is the candidate whose convention that it is, in the case of Romney, the Republican convention, in the case of Obama, the Democratic convention, gets a little bit of a bounce or a bump up in their poll numbers. So you may be at 52% today, then you have your convention, and you might be at 57% or 60% a few days from now, in terms of favorability ratings on the part of the American people, positive perceptions. Romney didn't get that much of a bump from his convention. But then, a little after that, President Obama and the Democrats had their convention. And interestingly enough, President Obama got a somewhat larger bump or move up in the polls as a result of what was seen to be a very well-organized convention and a number of great speeches, including by former President Bill Clinton, who took about 45 minutes to tell America, this is why you should vote for Barack Obama. And it was seen as a very successful speech. So that gets us past the conventions. Once we get past the conventions, we entered the fall campaign. And that's really the home stretch of the race. Remember, this is a race that's been going on for 2 years. And so starting in early September, last month, we finally get to the part of the campaign that is the home stretch and the most important phase. Let me make a few points about this part of the campaign, because I think it's important to understand what this phase means. Number one, most Americans really don't pay attention in detail to politics until after Labor Day in the United States, which is early September, the first week of September. That's when Americans sort of have a light go off in their mind and say, now I think I should pay attention to politics. And so people start to pay attention. Related to that, the two candidates really start to sharpen their message and adopt a fall message that is geared for the entire American electorate. So whereas the earlier part of the campaign, again, the Republicans tend to go more toward the right, the Democrats, particularly if they don't have an incumbent president, may go more toward the left. But ultimately they get back to the center, and the fall is when they sharpen those messages. Here let me make a point that is applicable to the fall, but is more applicable to all phases of the campaign as well. And that is fundraising. It takes an enormous amount of money to run for President of the United States. And the amount of money that you have to raise to be a credible candidate for president has gone up, not step by step, but geometrically over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, when Bill Clinton ran for president, he raised about $50 million. Today, both candidates are raising more than $1 billion each to run for president. and there are billions more that are pouring in other ways, which I'll say something about in a second. In other words, to run for president today, you have to raise 20 times more money than Bill Clinton raised in 1992. And he was a successful two-term president. So that says something about the impact of money. What does money buy? One word: communication. Because campaigns are only about communication. They're about the communication by the candidates of a particular sense of identity for America and a vision for America. And so, again, 2/3 of all the money, billions and billions and billions of dollars that are raised, goes to television. The rest of it goes to the internet, to getting staff, which are also part of your communications effort, and so forth and so on. I should note that if you happen to live in a state today where the race is very close, and I do, I live in Virginia, which is a state that may go for Obama or it may go for Romney. It's very, very close. When you turn on the television after work at night, around 7 o'clock, watch TV until 11 or 12 o'clock, you're going to see literally 50, 60, 70, 80 commercials on television where Obama is blasting Romney and Romney is blasting Obama. And everyone's blasting everybody. And you see these again and again and again. All the commercials, almost, at least it seems like it, are political commercials. That's what money buys. That's where 2/3 of everything goes to in terms of campaign fundraising. One other point to make is this election is different from all other elections before in one important way. There was a 2010 Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court of the United States made an important ruling regarding campaign finance. The case was called Citizens United. Citizens United. If you put that into a search, you'll see all the information. And to make a long story short, the Supreme Court ruled that political action committees, PACs or PACs, political action committees, could give limitless money with no limits whatsoever to any candidate that they wanted to give it to. And what that did was unleash even more billions in the form of PACs, also now called super PACs, which are basically enormous political action committees that any private citizen can start. I could start one today if I wanted to. Anyone can. And then you raise money and then you spend that money to support a candidate. So billions of dollars are coming in with no limits whatsoever. If I want to give $100 billion, I'm free to do that if I have those resources. And say, give it to Obama, to the super PAC that supports Obama, to beat up on Romney, or vice versa. So these are the things that are happening now that have, I think, increased the role of money and the impact of money in U.S. presidential politics. Is that a good thing for American democracy? I don't think it is, frankly. But there it is, and it's the law of the land, and it's legal. And that's something that we're coping with now. Let me also make another point about the fall campaign. In October of every presidential race, you have debates between the two candidates for president. Sometimes there are three people. In 1992, and I think in 96, but definitely in 92, there were three candidates who were debating each other. This year, of course, there were two, Obama and Romney. Did anyone here, if you saw the debates, please raise your hand. I'm just curious if any of you saw the debates. So just a couple of hands. 3, 4, okay, all right. Maybe a third of the group saw the debates. Let me just say, there's a kind of school of thought in American politics that the debates don't generally matter. And there's been a lot of research done on this, that the debates basically don't change minds, but they probably crystallize the thinking of people who already are sort of leaning one way or the other. So if I like Romney and I see the debates and I say, hey, he did pretty well, okay, I'll vote for Romney. It kind of has that effect. However, in 2012, it is possible, and we don't yet know, because we don't yet know the outcome of the race, but it is possible that the 2012 debates will be seen as a real turning point in this fall campaign and in the election. In short, Governor Romney, in the first debate, decisively defeated Barack Obama. It wasn't even close. And people who support Romney felt that way, and people who support Obama also felt that way. It was really, if you were an Obama supporter, very painful to watch. He did not do well in the debate. Now, in the second debate, well, as a result of that first debate, Romney's numbers went up pretty dramatically. And whereas Obama was leading by a decent margin before that, what happened after the debate is they got basically to the same place. And that is a significant step up for Governor Romney. Now, Obama did much better in the second debate. Most people would say he probably won the second debate, but not by the same margin that Romney won the first one. So he undid some of the damage, but still a lot of damage was done. And in the third debate, most people would say Obama won the third debate. But most people attached the most importance to the first debate. And it really energized Romney and his team and his supporters. And now we have a very even race. There are two other points I want to make. One is, at the end of a campaign, there are two things that you try to do. And that's where we are now. Closing arguments and get out the vote. Let me explain briefly. Closing arguments. You've been campaigning for 2 years. You've been saying millions and millions of words that are on the record. Millions of words worth of speeches and press conferences and everything. How do you crystallize it fundamentally into one sentence or two sentences? Preferably one. You develop a closing argument and you sell the American people that argument. It's the last thing they'll hear before they go and vote. So both campaigns are in the closing argument phase of the campaign. And I mentioned get out the vote. The most important thing that a candidate can do at the end of a campaign is make sure that the people who support him go and actually vote. In the United States of America, in presidential campaigns, generally speaking, only about 50% of eligible voters in the United States vote for president. In fact, much lower numbers vote for the other offices, such as senator, governor, congressman, and so on. So only half of Americans who could vote by law choose to vote. Why? Because someone has to pick up their child from school and doesn't have time, someone has a big work project, they're busy that day, someone is having some friends come and stay with them, so they have to go to the store to buy groceries. And for 1,000 mundane reasons, people just don't vote. So the most important thing you can do is get your people out to vote. And think about the fact that only 50% vote. You know, if you could get 60 or 70% of and get those numbers up, you could have a landslide victory on any given day. But that's the greatest challenge of a candidate in the end, is to actually inspire people to take action. Usually in the United States, the way you vote is you walk across the street or to a nearby elementary school or junior high school or high school. That's where we have polling. And you walk a short distance, a couple of 100 meters, and you go and you vote. But people don't spend the time even to do that. In U.S. elections, and it's been studied and I think analyzed with a lot of evidence to support this assertion, you generally can't change minds. In general, a Democrat is not going to get a Republican to vote for him most of the time. A Republican is not going to get a Democrat to vote for him most of the time. You're not really going to change anyone's mind. What you can do, though, is you can convince your people to go vote. So a lot of the communication is about energizing your people, and that's what it's valuable for. The last thing I would say before moving to the specific issues is it's important to understand the presidential contest in the United States for what it is. It is not a national contest. When we say, when you look at polls and it says 48% support Obama and 47% support Governor Romney, Does that matter? Not at all. You know why? Because we don't vote as a nation. We vote as 50 states. Each state votes. So the national number is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. What matters is how are you doing in each of the 50 states as states. And it's because we have an electoral college. I'll just say a few words about that. It's not a direct election of the president. I think many of you know. You're voting for president, but at the same time you're electing electors in the electoral college who then cast their votes based on states. So you have to win a statewide contest. That's why they say the presidential race is not a national contest. It's a contest of 50 different battlegrounds. And of those 50, today, we already know what the result is going to be in about 40 or 42 of those states, because states usually lean Republican or Democratic. So Massachusetts, or let's say New York, are Democratic states. They will vote for Barack Obama. We know that. They almost never vote for the Republican candidate for president these days. Texas and Mississippi will vote for Governor Romney. They will not vote for Democrat for president these days. We know that. But there are about 8 states where we don't know what's going to happen. And it's in those 8 states that the battle for this presidency is going to be won or lost. Let me say a few things about the issues, about the candidates and the issues, before turning quickly to China. Let me just give you the basics of what the Obama message is and what the Romney message is. Again, we have a scenario where we have an incumbent president, Obama, who's running for re-election against the backdrop of a very soft or weak U.S. economy. That's the basic story here. And he's being challenged by a Republican challenger because there's a sense on the part of many Americans that we don't see the kind of results in the U.S. economy that we would like to see. And that's fundamentally what this contest is about. Here's what Obama's basic message is, very broadly speaking. The country is on the right track. We're moving in the right direction. We need more time to finish the job. With more time, things will get better if we keep doing what we're doing. We need government to play an active and robust role in American life in various ways. And finally, our tax system should be fair, and it should ask people who are very wealthy to pay more. In essence, those are his basic themes as a candidate. What are Romney's themes? The United States is on the wrong track, not the right track. We're going in the wrong direction. Number 2, if we have 4 more years of Barack Obama, it will be a disaster for America. That's what Romney says. That 4 more years of Obama is going to take America down a path that is very dangerous for America. He also says that government should play a much smaller role in American life. This goes back to this idea that was made famous by Ronald Reagan when he took the presidential oath of office in January of 1981. He famously said, "Government is not the solution, government is the problem." So if it's the problem, what do? You cut government. That's what Romney believes. Romney is for less government. And as a result, he wants to cut taxes for everybody, including the ultra-wealthy, but also everybody else. And so he and Obama have a sharp difference in that area. You can see their visions and their messages are very different. They're really very different. Let me just say a few words about the key issues in this race. I think in broad terms, the 2012 presidential campaign is about 3 basic issues. And then we can add a 4th at the bottom. It's not as important as the other 3, but it's there. The first one is the economy. The second one is the national debt and deficits. And the third one is a debate about the proper size and role of government in the United States. Particularly with the example being the health care legislation that passed in 2010. Let me say a couple of words on each one. The economy really is the driving issue in this race. The American people are suffering in numbers that are unusual for the United States, as for all of the reasons that I described earlier. It's not a good time in the United States. It's a little better today than it was a few years ago, but it's still not great. Our unemployment is still at 7.8%. So the economy means jobs, job creation, manufacturing. These are the kinds of issues that are being discussed, along with the more fundamental issue of the United States as a nation among nations and the competition that we face economically from other nations, by the way, including China. So all of these fall under the economic issue, the economy. The second issue is debt and deficits. The United States today has an enormous national debt, $16 trillion. It has never had a debt that high in either ever or in recent memory. The size of our debt today, and certainly it has never had a debt that high when we were not at war, like World War. So the size of the debt today is approximately the size of the entire U.S. economy. And the U.S. economy is the biggest in the world. So this is a real problem. And it has an impact on our nation's economic future. And Americans are very concerned about the size of the debt and the size of our annual federal budget deficits. This issue bears on tax policy, because when you talk about debt, what we're saying is we're spending more than we're taking in, and what we take in is taxes. So when you talk about the debt or the deficit or how to reduce them, everything you say has something to do with taxes. So debt, deficit, taxes, that's the second issue. The third issue is basically the size and role of government. Obama believes that government can and should play a fairly significant role in American life. Romney believes government is playing too large a role in our life, and it must play a much smaller role. The big example of this, and there's a big debate in America, is over health care and what role the government should play in providing health insurance to the American people. And a major piece of legislation was passed in 2010. It's referred to by many, now including the president, as Obamacare. I think it was the American Health Care Act of 2010 is the technical name. But basically, it brings government into the health care equation in a much more substantial way. Romney disagrees with that, and many Republicans, most Republicans disagree. And Romney has said if he becomes president on day one, he cancels Obamacare. So there's a huge debate about that. But it's really a proxy debate for a broader issue, which is what role should government play in our lives in America. Now, foreign policy, as you may have noticed, isn't one of the big three issues. But in recent weeks, it's come to be a more significant issue in the context mostly of the Middle East. And the one thing that really essentially brought foreign policy into the discussion was what happened in Benghazi. The U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other diplomatic personnel were killed by terrorists. That was a tragedy. I'm a former State Department diplomat, so I feel acutely that sense of loss, as all Americans do. But interestingly enough, and sadly, this issue became very politicized shortly after it happened. And now the question is not the loss of life. The interesting question being debated in America fiercely is, did Obama tell the American people the truth about what happened in Benghazi? That's what Americans are asking. Some believe, yeah, he did. Some believe he did not. And so now that is a foreign policy type of issue that is really, in a sense, a proxy for a broader issue of the truthfulness of our president. But that's in the mix now, and that was a big part of the debates. Let me say a few words about what I see as the strengths and weaknesses of Obama and Romney, just very briefly. And I'll come back to China in a minute, by the way, because that deserves its own section. here's Obama's strengths or advantages. He's the incumbent president. Usually incumbents win, rarely incumbents lose. The only two exceptions recently were George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter. But there are more cases where a one-term president becomes a two-term president. Reagan, Clinton, and George W. Bush were all two-term presidents, and they all won re-election with larger majorities of the vote than the first time. And so incumbency is an advantage. The economy is getting a little better. That's an advantage for Obama. He's had a little bit of an advantage recently raising money. In September, he raised $181 million. $181 million in September. Nearly 4 times what Bill Clinton raised in 1992 in a year and a half. So that gives you a sense of the geometric increase that we've seen in fundraising. And Obama has also had some significant foreign policy successes, most notably killing Osama bin Laden, who took the lives of 3,000 Americans and people from many other nations on September the 11th. What are Obama's weaknesses as perceived by average people? Number one, the economy is still not doing very well. Number two, the newness and excitement of Obama has kind of worn off. Number three, some of his policies are rather controversial, including the healthcare legislation. And there's a big debate, as I mentioned, about whether that's the right thing to do. So there's some controversy there. And perhaps fourth, and one could do a longer list, but he really performed very, very poorly in the first debate, and it damaged him seriously. So these are the weaknesses of Obama. The debate gave the impression to the American people, to many Americans, including his supporters, including Democrats, that it was almost as if, it seemed almost as if Obama didn't care. It didn't matter to him whether he was elected president again. And that's not what you want to convey to voters. The voters want someone who wants the job, because there's a lot to do and you need somebody who feels energized. By the way, let me say, televised debates have been a part of American presidential campaigns since 1960, the Kennedy-Nixon debate. And you usually have 3 debates now every fall. As I mentioned, there were 3 between Obama and Romney. What really matters is how you look on television. When they show one person, the other side of the television screen shows the face of the other person. So not only can you see what the person A is saying, you see how person B is reacting. And it was that damaged Obama very seriously in the debate. When Romney was talking, Obama was sort of looking down. When Romney looked at Obama, Obama looked down and didn't look back at Romney. And it just gave an impression of listlessness that didn't go over well with the American people. So let me go to Romney. His strengths: he's from the private sector. He understands economics because he's been in the economic business, the business, if you will, of business. He's been involved in job creation, also been involved in, some would say, job outsourcing. But the fact is, he has a great record of success in the private sector. And that's something the American people respect. He had a terrific first debate. We've talked about that. That's a strength. And he also, in many ways, is benefiting from the fact that, of course, the economy still isn't doing that great. Is it better today than it was a year ago? Yes. Is it doing great? No. And Romney is benefiting from that as a candidate. What are Romney's weaknesses? I think Romney battles with the perception that he is a member of the elite. He is an extremely wealthy man, many hundreds of millions of dollars. He earned it all the old-fashioned way in business, and that's great. But a lot of Americans say, that guy has so much money, how could he understand the concerns of me, someone who makes $42,000 a year? And he doesn't seem like he's one of us. And so there's a perception that he is too elite. I think more fundamentally, there's also a weakness in the Romney candidacy in the sense that he has flip-flopped on different issues over his career. He used to be for position A, now he's against position A. He used to be for position B, now he's against it. For example, at one point, he supported a woman's right to make the choice to have an abortion. That's a big issue in the United States. Now, he's against it. He used to be in favor of gay marriage. Now, he's against it. He used to be for health care reform in his state of Massachusetts that was very similar. In fact, it was the model for the U.S. healthcare plan at the federal level. Now, he's against it. And he's come out with different positions on foreign policy issues. Romney is a very smart guy. But in the view of many Americans, he's gone from this side to this side many times in his career. So the question is, can we trust this guy? So those are the strengths, I think, and weaknesses of the two candidates. Let me just say a few things about China and how the role it has played in the race before concluding with a few comments about the last home stretch of this race. China has been a big factor in U.S. presidential politics for quite a while. It figured in a major way in 1992. To a greater or lesser degree, it's been a part of presidential races since that time. But one thing that's very interesting is that American presidential candidates and the president himself are talking about China in a way that is very different from how they used to talk about China. It used to be, and here let me say, I think there are three basic shifts that have occurred in the way American political leaders talk about China, and they're very fundamental. Shift number one is that China used to be a human rights issue. Only. That's what it was. Today, it is not a human rights issue at all. Today, it is only an economic and national competition issue. That is a big, big difference. Not one word has been said about China human rights in this presidential campaign. That is a remarkable change from where we were a few short years ago. Number two, China used to be a foreign policy issue for the United States. Today, it is not a foreign policy issue anymore. It is a domestic policy issue. What do I mean by that? It used to be that we talked about China when we talked about foreign affairs, when we talked about diplomacy, when we talked about international relations. Now, when we talk about those things, we don't talk at all about China. We talk about China only when we're talking about the U.S. domestic economy. We talk about China when we talk about jobs. We talk about China when we talk about manufacturing, when we talk about outsourcing, when we talk about, quote, losing jobs to China. We talk about China when we talk about energy. We talk about China when we talk about solar panels and wind turbines being made in China. We talk about Chinese students' test scores being better than American students' test scores. None of those are foreign policy issues. But that's how we talk about China. When President Obama gave the State of the Union address in 2012, and also in 2011, his most important national address once a year, delivered before both houses of Congress in January. This year, in 2012, his speech, as all president's speeches typically do, have a domestic policy section and a foreign policy section. China was not mentioned at all in the foreign policy section, but China was mentioned 4 times in the domestic policy section. That's what I mean when I say that China is no longer a foreign policy issue, and that has implications. By the way, Governor Romney, let me make a point about the Republican side, because it's true for both Democrats and Republicans. When the Republicans were debating foreign policy, fighting for the nomination in the primaries, Romney and quite a few others, they had a debate every few nights. In all, they had about 25 or two dozen or so debates with 8 people, 7 people, 8 people, 6 people, and it got smaller and smaller. At the end, it was 3 or 4. But they had some 24 debates. 6 or so of those debates were about foreign policy. China was never mentioned in any of them. Isn't that weird? Isn't that strange? but China was mentioned in the domestic policy debates. So we don't think of China anymore as a foreign issue. We think of China in America as an issue that hits our heart and hits us very close to home. That's why China is being discussed in the way that it is today. Let me say a quick word about campaign advertising. There are an awful lot of ads on the air right now about China that mention China, but it's not really about China. It's about talking about China. Oh, by the way, sorry, let me do one thing first. There is a third change. I just realized I forgot to mention that. There's a third change. The first one, human rights, before, now, national competition. The second one, foreign policy, domestic policy. The third change is candidates used to speak about China only as a measuring stick to measure their personal toughness. Look how tough I am by what I say about China. But while that continues in the race to some degree, what is more common today is to speak about China as a measuring stick, not for the candidate, but for our nation. Americans measure our success today relative to China. And that's a remarkable change in the United States. So China has become a measuring stick for the national worth of the United States of America and for our national adequacy or inadequacy. Governor Romney said something very remarkable. He said it earlier this year, and I noted it at the time, and I was one of the first people to point this out. And later he said it again in the second debate, and then the whole nation saw it. He said, if I become president, I will look at the U.S. federal budget, and I will ask a simple question. Is spending this money so important that it's worth borrowing from China? If the answer is yes, I'll spend it. If the answer is no, I won't. So Governor Romney has taken the remarkable position of measuring all federal spending against the China test. Is it worth borrowing from China to do this? Social Security, military, education, energy, environment. Every dollar that the government spends, he wants to say, is it important enough to borrow money from China? That's extraordinary. I mean, that's one of the most striking comments I've ever heard in the history of a major party candidate running for president. But it shows you how deeply China has seeped into the American mind and the American psyche. What are the implications of this race going to be for China and for U.S.-China relations? The short answer is, and I'll conclude here shortly, I think the implications are not going to be very significant in the end. And that is because there's actually very good bipartisan consistency between the United States and China, and between, rather, the Democrats and the Republicans on U.S.-China relations and on U.S. policy toward China. And despite the fairly tough talk of Governor Romney, and to a certain degree, the tough talk of President Obama, the reality is, I think, whoever is elected, certainly if it's Obama, will see continuity. And in the event that Romney is elected, I think we'll also see great continuity. There will be a few minor things here and there, but basically I don't expect, despite the rhetoric, that this election will have much of an implication either way on the positive development of U.S.-China relations. However, the fact that China has become a domestic policy issue in America, and the fact that it is no longer seen as way over there where all the other foreign policy questions are, it's a domestic policy issue, which means it's right here in front of my face as an American voter. That is going to have a long-term impact on the relationship. We can talk about that later. Let me just conclude by saying a couple of things about the home stretch. We're in the last week of the election. Next week is November 6th. Tuesday is when people will go to vote. Some people do vote early, by the way. I'm one of them. I've already voted. I voted a few days ago. Many millions of Americans are starting to do that, but most people vote on Election Day. And this race is going to boil down to a few states. We know how 40 or 41 or 42 of the states are going to vote. We know that. So we don't need to pay attention to those places. In fact, the presidential campaigns are not spending money on advertising in those states because you don't have to. No one would be advertising in any serious way in Texas because that's easy. You don't advertise in New York because that's easy. It's already done. But those last states are going to be critical. Which states are they? Whoever wins Ohio will probably be the next president of the United States. Ohio is a critical state, and the Republicans essentially have to win it to win. No Republican has ever won the White House without winning Ohio, in the heart of America, the heartland of America, in the Midwest. But Obama, it was said earlier, didn't have to win Ohio. He could win elsewhere. But now even the Democrats are saying they need to win Ohio too. So America's future, to some degree, is going to boil down to what the good people of Ohio decide to do on November 6th. But also Virginia. Very tough state, very close, could go either way. Florida could go either way. Colorado could go either way. They're leaning this way or that, but basically these are swing states. Iowa is another one. Some say New Hampshire. Some say Wisconsin, but I don't think Wisconsin is really in play. It's probably about 6 states. And the key ones are Ohio, Virginia, and Florida. And arguably Iowa and Colorado are fairly significant too. That's where this race is going to be decided. By the way, it's interesting to note that some commentators point out that the people who decide who becomes president in America is one group of people. Suburban, married women. They decide who the president is. Because most other groups, we know how they're going to vote. We know how Latin Americans will vote, except for Cubans, they vote a different way, Cuban Americans. We know how Black Americans vote. We know how Jewish folks vote. We know how fundamentalist Christians vote. We know how white males vote if they've received a certain education. We know how they vote if they haven't. We can slice and dice the electorate in many different ways. There's only one group that you never really know exactly how they're going to go, and that's suburban women. And so basically, suburban women in Ohio will decide the next president of the United States. Really interesting to think about. Let me just say a few final comments here. The American people, I think, are looking at a very close race and a stark choice in front of our country. There really are 2 different paths ahead of us, and there really is a fork in the road. And we have some, as the saying goes, some hard choosing to do. These paths differ to a degree that I think we have not seen, I believe, in any presidential election in my lifetime, or certainly in my memory. I think we have a greater contrast of visions than we've probably ever seen before. And so I think people are taking this choice very seriously. We have 9 days to go. A lot of votes are already coming in, early voting. November 6th is when all the rest of the 100 million plus votes will come in. And probably on the night of November 6th, America time, and probably on the morning of November 7th or lunchtime here, we'll know who the next president is going to be. One way or the other, I think America will move forward. As someone once said, America is strong enough to survive any president. And we will endure on. But unquestionably, the winner of the race on November 6th is going to have a tremendous impact on what happens in the future, on U.S.-China relations, on America's relations with the world. And for those reasons, I think it's a fascinating time to be thinking about these issues. And I'm really grateful that you would choose to spend the evening here with me, and I thank you very much for your time. Thank you.